Now, South Africa's scholar transport system is under intense scrutiny after the Vanderbijlpark crash that killed 14 learners. And now a wave of enforcement operations is exposing just how widespread non-compliance can be. Worn tyres, defective brakes, invalid PRDPs, expired discs and dangerous overloading. But behind the enforcement headlines is a harder question. What are the economics pushing parts of the sector into informality and non-compliance? And who ultimately pays the price? In Gauteng, government inspections recently found almost all vehicles tested at one station were non-compliant, while operator groups argue permit delays and financial strain are worsening the problem. To unpack the money, incentives, regulation and rights implications, we're joined by Matshidiso Lencoasa, a budget researcher at Section 27 on the economics of scholar transport. Matshidiso, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming into the show.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this.
So when we talk about the economics of scholar transport, what comes to mind?
Yeah, so I think that, the recent incidences around scholar transport have been heartbreaking across the country, understandably so, but I think that they've been pointing out to what we have seen to be an ongoing crisis with scholar transport. So we're looking at the majority of people who should be, or learners who should be benefiting from this important intervention that is supposed to overcome barriers to accessing schooling. And most of these learners come from economically vulnerable households. So we see this across the country. So you have learners who are supposed to benefit from some form of scholar transport intervention and are not receiving that such intervention. We see it a lot in schools in more rural contexts as well. So in KZN, we saw a protest of learners, parents, because the school was closed down, and that would mean that the learners would have to walk 10 kilometers to access the school. So you get learners who should be getting interventions for scholar transport but are not, and they're risking their lives every day walking dangerous conditions so that they can get quality basic education. Then you also get learners who are getting access to scholar transport and the state is intervening, but then because the scholar transport system is in need of much needed intervention and overhaul and reforms, it means that often the people who the scholar transport providers are not paid on time, and so the system fails and breaks down, and then it leaves many learners stranded. What this means is that you have parents who are already relying on grant money or not, who have very limited financial, opportunities or abilities to get their children to school in a way that doesn't inhibit some of those barriers to access, but the problem is then they have very limited opportunities or ability to do that. So we have learners who are failed by the system in that way, especially we saw that in the Northwest and Mpumalanga of reports of learners who are stranded. And then we also have learners who do benefit more, whose parents use private transport, which we see in Gauteng, which is still, even though they can perhaps maybe are not eligible for scholar transport interventions because of the provincial decisions, what that means is that these parents who are economically vulnerable will try to find like the cheapest way or the most affordable way to get their children to school. And often it's quite informal, and it also means that there's been a lot of non-compliance. Either way, with a crisis like this, ultimately it is learners across the country who are risking their lives. So,
Matshidiso, you've walked us through the economics, but I think there's also another element that we need to speak to, and that speaks to the integrity of the individuals that are offering scholar transport, right? So in the event that you aren't paid, we've seen many suppliers in the past who have picketed, right? And come out and said, okay, we haven't been paid, we're not going to operate. This, in my view, proffers an opportunity for those individuals. But how many of these individuals are just unscrupulous businessmen, right? Who are looking to profit, who have no care for the quality of vehicles, the tyres that they drive, etc. And most evident in the fact that an individual will load 49 kids on a scholar transport, as was recently discovered in Cape Town, or instances where an individual, Vanderbijlpark, results in the death of 14 youngsters because he continues to recklessly drive on the highway.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point, is that when you have unscrupulous business people who don't care about or who don't foreground the best interest of learners and rather foreground profiteering, for instance, which is what we see when there is private sector intervention, what that means is that it's the learners who are risking their lives. And so a program or intervention that's supposed to work towards realizing or giving all learners across the country quality basic education, it ends up being compromised in that way. And so I think it's important that we've now, unfortunately, we've had these incidences that are endangering children's lives, learners' lives, but it is also important to see how the state responds to this. What can the state do to ensure that it can protect learners? How can families protect learners from these unscrupulous business practices? And I think interventions like what Gauteng has introduced around monitoring the safety and inspecting, the quality of the vehicles, et cetera, it is long overdue interventions, but it's only one part of an intervention that really, a program that really needs reform.
Well, you've talked about an overhaul, Matshidiso, so let's talk about that overhaul. So these regular or periodic inspections are absolutely critical and should be done all the time. But what are some of those other factors that you speak to that need to be implemented?
Sure. So I think one of the key factors is that when it comes to scholar transport and funding and the decisions that impact these learners, it does come across as quite a political exercise. So for the longest time, the scholar transport and our friends at Equal Education have called for ring fencing of scholar transport budgets, because what we have is that when there are budget cuts or when there are issues or underfunding or like provincial departments are in debt, the first things that receive funding allocations will be teachers, will be infrastructure, which are all really crucial to quality basic education. But of course, getting learners to school in a safe way is also part of that, but it hasn't been a priority area because it hasn't been, topical in the same way, but it's still crucial. And I think that now's an opportunity with the State of the Nation address and the budget speech that's coming up to really be thinking about the tools that we have at our disposal so that we can ensure that, we get the best of the best who are serving these learners and not necessarily unscrupulous business owners who are trying to maximize their profits, but also people who want to put learners' best interest at the heart of it.
And that's where we wrap up that conversation. Matshidiso, thanks so much for coming onto the show.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Matshidiso Lencoasa, budget researcher at Section 27, speaking to us on the issues around scholar transport. In fact, the economics around scholar transport and the opportunities that exist to government to come in and make a change.